Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new build in my series building Nancy Drew in The Sims 4. Today I am bringing you another recreation of a location within the Nancy Drew games. The list for these recreations has definitely gotten shorter, but we still have a handful of locations to get to, and this is one that I've been meaning to do for a while, but we are doing Thornton Hall today. So this is, of course, kind of the main building in Ghost of Thornton Hall, the mystery that takes place in the deep American South in Georgia, and it definitely in the game is a very spooky and haunted and grand and dilapidated old building, and it's designed with a very classical architecture in mind, mainly because of all of the columns that are on this build. And man, are there a lot of columns. That was honestly probably the biggest struggle, was trying to figure out a way to get the columns just right, because it's actually really hard to get the columns all the way up to 2 stories and still looking good and matching up nicely. So what I decided to do instead was use columns just stacked on top of one another, but because they really go all the way around the build itself, it took a really long time, and I guess that's just a feature of kind of that like Gothic classic architecture kind of style that we see. The outside of the build itself is actually fairly simple. Thornton Hall is really just a big rectangle with a lot of architectural details on the outside. So I spent a lot of time just kind of finessing it to try and get it to look as close as possible to the game itself. But one thing that I had a hard time accomplishing was the scale of everything. So Thornton Hall in the game looks really big, but when you start to build it based on the number of windows and the number of doors and the scale in The Sims, it looks a lot smaller. So it actually ended up being a lot smaller of a build than I thought it would be. I wouldn't call this a small build by any means. It's definitely a bigger sized building overall, and it does end up having 4 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. So I mean, it's still a pretty reasonably sized house. It has I believe 2 living rooms technically. If you were to renovate it, one of the rooms could be an office. There's a kitchen and a formal dining room, so it's definitely still a sizable house. But I just feel like it looks a lot bigger in the game than it ended up looking in The Sims. And hey, that's just one of the things that we run into with doing these recreations. I did cut out a lot of my roof fidgeting and my column fidgeting and the floor plan fidgeting because this build did take me a very long time. It was a multiple hour build. It was probably about 4 hours of building time, and a lot of that time was spent for this exterior part on changing the colors of the columns, changing how many columns there were, trying to change the roof and getting the roof just right, and just changing all of those things didn't seem like super interesting things to watch in a build. So we're cutting ahead here to the landscaping, which might be the part of the build that I'm happiest with. I actually really enjoyed kind of doing my own thing for the landscaping, because in the game itself, in Thornton Hall, we have this really spooky cemetery that's more towards the front of Black Rock Island, more towards the front of the property, and then there's a whole other house. But then other than that, we have this long walkway with all these beautiful weeping willow trees. I believe they're weeping willows, and maybe they're magnolia trees. Somebody who actually knows foliage from the south should let me know what kinds of trees they are, but to me, based on what I'm familiar with, they look like weeping willow trees where like the branches kind of hang down and everything. So that's what I ended up using in the game. I could be completely wrong, and they could be a completely different kind of tree. But we have this beautiful walkway up to Thornton Hall, and I wanted to still kind of get that across, even though I built this on a smaller lot. I didn't want to build it on a giant lot and then just have a ton of empty space for The Sims. It just ends up being it looks empty, and then you have a bunch of extra loading that you don't need on a lot, because then you just have this giant space that has to load with no real purpose. So rather than doing that, I decided to kind of be inspired by the mood of Thornton Hall and do these gardens on both sides of the house. And I'm showing you the one on the right side of the house. The left side ends up being basically the same with just a few different trees on the left-hand side. And we have this kind of dirt path that leads to this really pretty fountain. And then all of these plants, I was building in fall, so all of these plants usually have flowers on them, but I kind of liked how they looked more dead and spooky, because that's definitely the vibe that we get in Ghost of Thornton Hall. Things are dead and spooky. So that was definitely what I was trying to go for. I used a lot of items from the Vampires game pack, including these scraggly rose bushes and this creepy haunted looking tree and these big huge ferns with these deep rich colors to them. And I just really enjoyed how it looked. It's kind of overgrown and creepy, but beautiful at the same time. I honestly really enjoy overgrown landscaping. I think personally that's the prettiest kind of landscaping, just because I like the idea of nature overtaking everything and being allowed to do its own thing. So I had a lot of fun kind of making that happen on both sides of the house. That's another thing about Thornton Hall too, is that it's very symmetrical. So the entire exterior is a very, like, what you have on the left side is also what you have on the right side. So I cut out doing the landscaping on the left hand side as well, because you have already seen it, and doing the interior took me a very long time. So we are now cutting to that and working on that. We are starting here with this front parlor area, and this is where Clara Thornton hangs out, the mother of Jessalyn Thornton. And the scale was very close to being what I wanted it to be. It does look a little weird because this piano is definitely smushed in right next to the fireplace, but in the game there's this broken down piano in the corner. So I definitely wanted to make sure I included a piano. My idea with the entire build, so this whole recreation, is that I'm building Thornton Hall in its heyday. So I'm building Thornton Hall as I kind of imagine it would have looked before it became essentially a ruin, before it became super haunted and abandoned, and before people avoided it like the plague. So I wanted to restore it a little bit to kind of its former glory. This is probably what Thornton Hall looked like shortly after Charlotte Thornton's death. That's kind of my interpretation of it, is that this is probably what it looked like shortly after she died. So it hasn't been dilapidated yet, but like nobody is currently living in it. Everybody is kind of gone, but all the furniture remains, and it hasn't yet started to fall apart, hasn't yet started to fall to pieces. So the only rooms that we get to see in Thornton Hall, one of them is this parlor. So I tried to put furniture in all of the places that we see in the game. I tried to put portraits and paintings in the same places. There are, of course, a couple of things that are different. I mean, there's colors that are different and shapes and whatnot that's a little bit different, but that's just me kind of trying to maintain the integrity of this space while also trying to make it a functional room in The Sims that looks good, which is always the balance. That's always the challenge. The only other rooms that we see on the interior of Thornton Hall, there's this workshop space, weirdly enough, that is almost supposed to be, it's kind of alluded to that it used to be a space where workers worked. So like the Thornton family had workers that helped run their business. It's kind of skirted around whether those workers were voluntary or not. But this room in the back corner of the house was supposed to be kind of like this workshop station, and it looks like a shed. Like the inside of it looks like a shed, and I've always been a little bit confused by it. I love the story of Thornton Hall, so I've never really questioned it that much. It doesn't really bother me, but I've always been kind of like, what is this separate space, and why can't we see any of the rest of the bottom of Thornton Hall? Because if you look at it from the outside, it's huge. Like, it's this big building, and the rooms that we see on the inside are not that big, and we only see that one on the bottom floor and the parlor. So I had to kind of imagine what the rest of the bottom floor would look like, and rather than having that workshop space, I made that back corner into a kitchen. Right now we're moving on to the formal dining room, which again we don't see in the game, but I have to imagine would have existed somewhere on this lower level. So I decided to put it to the left of the staircase, and I just went for a very grand look. I really enjoyed using really royal colors throughout the entirety of Thornton Hall. So we've got really rich reds, really deep blues, really vibrant emerald greens, just really royal colors, colors that you would see on like really precious stones, like rubies and emeralds and sapphires, definitely going for that kind of opulence theme. And kind of along with that theme of opulence, I also wanted to make the build feel empty. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, because I thought that this was after the building had kind of been abandoned, so nobody is currently living here. And two, even when people were living in Thornton Hall, I kind of get the idea that it would feel like a place that doesn't have a lot of real personality to it, because the people who built Thornton Hall weren't necessarily the most pure of heart. And that maybe sounds kind of like, woo, hippy-dippy, but the idea that the people who put this place together weren't really concerned with, you know, joy and happiness and compassion and putting together a space that reflects all of those things. They were more about putting together a space that hits all the right notes. Like superficially, I mean, beautiful, right? Like it's got all the right colors and everything is color coordinated. The wood tones all match. The curtains are the same throughout the entirety of the build. Like everything is very picture perfect and very regal and very wealthy looking, but there's not a whole ton of character to it. There's not a ton of decoration. The character that does come through really probably comes through in all of the portraits that are around the house, and we kind of get that within the ruins as well. The things that connect us or make it feel like people used to be there are all of these portraits, but even then, it kind of feels like people haven't been present mentally and emotionally within Thornton Hall for a very long time. Like people may have been physically present, but actually like feeling and experiencing things within this building, I don't know if that's a thing that happened. It doesn't seem like a particularly happy place to me, and I think it kind of bred those feelings of anger and resentment. And I mean, we hear about the spooky shadows or the hungry shadows that Clara's mother used to tell her about. All of these things just make it seem, even when it wasn't completely dilapidated, it was still not really a very full, happy place. So I don't clutter it up a lot. I don't decorate it a lot. I put in things that seem necessary, and I tried to make sure that everything was very cohesive in its design. And I talked all the way through the design of the kitchen here. But I enjoyed using kind of the rich black and gold colors in this space, using really nice appliances. Like everything is very nice. That's definitely what I was trying to go for. But at the same time, you know, there's no kids' projects on the counters. There's no books laying around that people have been reading. It's very tidy. There's no works of art in progress. Everything has a purpose, and that purpose mostly is just kind of being impressive or functional. So that was the goal. Hopefully you guys think that I achieved that. It is always interesting when we see so little of a build in the game, but the building itself definitely has to be a big building, right? It has to be huge, and yet we only see a couple rooms in this space. So then kind of imagining and trying to extrapolate, okay, what is the rest of this building supposed to look and feel like? That's always an interesting challenge, and something that I really enjoy about these recreations. That's also why they take me like 4 hours, is because I'm constantly overthinking all of it. Like, would they have that there? What color would be in this space? And at first I had storage in this little butler's pantry, and I was like, wait, no, they would have a full service bar so that the servants could make them like really fancy drinks, and so they could impress their guests with all of these like really nicely made cocktails and everything. So little things like that, just constantly second guessing But yeah, that is what this space is more of like a butler's pantry kind of thing. So I imagined it being used for storage, and again, it's a transition space between the kitchen and into the dining room. So like in fancier houses of old, of the past, this would be the space where the servants would like get the food all ready to prepare, they get it on fancy nice trays, and then they would be able to go through from the kitchen into the dining room. And all the fancy rich people eating at the table wouldn't have to see the food being prepared or anything like that, because how terrible would that be? Anyway, we're now moving on to the formal living room. So the parlor area I imagined was more of like the waiting space. So that's where people, if you're throwing a really fancy dinner party at a really fancy mansion with rich people, the idea is that the parlor is where your guests would wait before they're formally invited into the rest of the house, essentially. So the doorman, the butler, whoever would invite them into that parlor space, and they would have their cup of tea. There would be someone in there playing piano. That would be kind of like the waiting room. And then dinner would be served, and you would then meet your hosts. Not necessarily meet them for the first time, but you know what I mean, like meet them for the event, and you would have your fancy dinner party, and everyone would sit around the table and talk money and politics and all of these things. And then you would adjourn to the formal living room. And in a lot of like really old formal living rooms, they were kind of divided up into spaces for like the men and the women. Like the men would go play billiards and have their scotch and whiskey and whatnot, and the women would go like play cards and just gossip and drink tea or something like that, which I didn't have space to do 2 separate living room areas, but I can kind of imagine. I put a card table over in the corner. I can kind of imagine like the men with their cigars going over there and playing some poker while the ladies sit on these couches and sip their champagne and talk about everybody else in town, gossip about everybody, because that's what people did. That's what people still do, but just in different ways. So yeah, putting in the card table here, I wanted to make sure that this build had enough things to do in it as well, so that if you ever did want to use it for like a family and play out kind of like that rich household storyline, there were still things to do. There's no TV and there's no computer. Both could easily be added. There's an extra sitting room on the second level. You could put a TV in this formal living room above the fireplace instead of the art, and the desk that's in the parlor could easily have a computer added onto it, but it just didn't feel right putting electronics in this build. It didn't feel right to me to have any sort of technology, even though people, when they lived in it, technology existed. Like, they could have had computers or they could have had TVs. That technology was definitely there, but it just didn't feel right. And it didn't necessarily feel like the people who lived at Thornton Hall would purchase those things necessarily. I mean, even just having non-candle lights seems like a little bit of a stretch, in my humble opinion. So the hallway here, just adding a couple of decorations, trying to fill it in. When I put artwork on the walls, I tried as often as possible to make sure that it was a portrait, because that's one of the things on the interior of Thornton Hall that Nancy interacts with most frequently, is the portraits of all of the previous Thorntons within the build itself. So like along the walls, she can find Thorntons from the 1800s and Thorntons from the 1900s and Thorntons from the present, and learn a little bit about them and use their history to learn more about what's going on in the present, which I think is very cool and is definitely one of the reasons that I love the storyline of this game so much. It's very similar in a way to Curse of Blackmore Manor, which I think also does a really, really nice job of fleshing out the history of a family that's been around for a really long time and has a lot of skeletons in its closet, and therefore is extremely interesting. So I had a lot of fun with that. We're moving on to decorating the 3 bedrooms now that we don't see in the game. Again, I had to play around with the floor plan up here to kind of make it more functional, and it's not exactly like it is in the game at all. Charlotte's room is essentially in the same place, but the door is not, because there's like somehow another hallway within the game where you kind of walk up the stairs, and to the front and the left there's this rounded alcove, which is interesting because there's definitely not any rounded areas on the exterior of the build. It literally is just a giant square when you look at it. So there's somehow this rounded area, and then you turn to the right, and then there's somehow this really long hallway with a door at the end of it, not on the side of it, with a door at the end of it that's supposed to have then Charlotte's bedroom. But it's like, if I put a hallway there, Charlotte's bedroom would be hanging over the garden, and that wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. So I did modify the floor plan a little bit. But I did have a lot of fun decorating the bedrooms up here. I didn't decorate them for any particular Thornton necessarily. So a lot of the stuff in these bedrooms is more just put together because it looks nice together. And that's part of what I was trying to say earlier, is that like this place doesn't have a ton of personality. It doesn't necessarily feel like a real person with real interests necessarily lives in these bedrooms. And it's certainly possible that like when Harper slept in this bedroom, for example, that maybe there were things laying all over the floor and stuff on the dressers and just interesting things. But when the Thorntons picked up and left, or whatever happened to them, the place was cleaned up and then just kind of left in this sterile, almost dead feeling space. Like, again, I wanted it to still look pretty, so I hope you guys think it still looks pretty together. But there's also not a ton of decoration, not a ton of indication about who would live in this space, like their hobbies or their interests or what makes them tick, stuff like that. It was more about color coordinating. So that's a very long way of saying that this is the blue room. I was going for kind of like a lunar kind of thing in this room, so the color tones being blues and grays and dark browns, and I really enjoyed how it turned out. This room is the purple room, so we're going with this like very rich purple color, this amethyst royal purple, and then blacks and dark browns as well. And all of the rooms have basically the bare necessities. We've got a big fancy bed. You have 2 tables, bedside tables with lamps on them. You have mirrors and you have dressers, and sometimes like an extra chair to sit on. So the rooms have the bare necessities. They're meant to look very pretty, very gorgeous, and they certainly could be filled in with things that indicate personality, but at present, they aren't necessarily. They all have the same curtains, they all have the same floors, they all have the same furniture sets in the same colors. I still really like how they turned out though. Like, I think they're really pretty, and I really enjoyed using the deep royal colors. You guys should let me know if you were to stay at Thornton Hall in this version of it, which room you would want to stay in. Would you want to stay in the blue room, the purple room, the green room, or it was originally the red room that I was going to make Charlotte's room, but when I actually looked at Charlotte's room in the game, she doesn't actually have red wallpaper, which I was kind of surprised by since her theme is very red overall. I was kind of surprised, honestly, that her room didn't have red wallpaper. It was more of like a green, like almost like a mustardy green, which is interesting, and we don't really have anything like that in The Sims, but you'll see how I managed that a little bit later. Right now we're moving on to the green room, and this is definitely the one with the most masculine energy, so like perhaps Wade would have slept in this room, but who knows? There's not a whole ton of indication of the interests of the person who slept in this room, but it does have these tan notes, like light browns, dark browns, and greens is really what I was going for in this space. So again, a little bit more masculine energy, some fancy artwork on the walls, you got your dressers, you got your mirrors, and I really liked how it turned out. So yeah, I wonder if Thornton Hall, at this point in its existence, like, I guess since Charlotte has passed away by this point, at least in my headcanon, the building would already be haunted by this point, but I'm wondering, like, if before Thornton's death, Charlotte's death, that Thornton Hall was haunted or not. I feel like it would have to be. I mean, Clara talks about the hungry shadows, and there was a lot of like turmoil, a lot of negative energy going on with the Thornton family. I feel like it was haunted well before Charlotte, and then she came along and was like the head honcho ghost, and now that becomes the main story that Nancy encounters within the game, which I think is a really interesting idea. I, again, really like Thornton Hall, Ghost of Thornton Hall. I think it's a beautiful mystery. I think the characters are really compelling. The location is really, really beautiful, and I love how complete it feels, even though it's like weirdly fragmented in ways, I still think it ends up being complete because the vibe is just so consistent. So even though we only see teeny little rooms that don't have any functionality, or we see rooms that seem to be connected to the building and yet somehow are not, and we've got these like basement spaces and these weird tunnels and everything, despite all of that, I think the vibe is really on point in every single one of those spaces. I don't think the vibe in this game lapses for even a second, and that's what makes it so successful in my mind, is that it is always creepy, it is always unsettling, there is always something new to discover or uncover, some new secret to find, and I really appreciate that about this game. I think it's really, really cool. Now I'm just finishing up decorating this hallway up here. I was like kind of waffling for a while about what to do with this space and try and figure out what would make the most sense. So the long hallway itself is just decorative, so that's all we do with that, is just add some more portraits and some simple decorations. Again, everything nicely color coordinated. And then the right hand side, I just decided to make it more of like an informal sitting area. So maybe like this is where the family would hang out if they were sitting and talking, not necessarily guests, or if guests did come up here, they would have to be like really trusted guests, like best friends of the teens could maybe come up here and hang out in this little sitting area. And I'm speaking like when Harper and Clara and Wade were teenagers, that all of these social rules would still be followed, like the social rules that would have happened during like the 19th century or something. Probably not the case, but I like to think about Thornton Hall during that time and about the grand opulence that would have been a thing at Thornton Hall and would have been very much on the mind of everyone living at Thornton Hall, wanting to really convey their wealth and their power and their status, which is very interesting. So now we are going to move on to Charlotte's bedroom, which is probably like the magnum opus of the entire game itself. Like, Charlotte's bedroom, you spend most of the game trying to get into the darn place. It's locked for so long, and then when you finally get in there, it's like this really big, exciting moment, and I just love that. I love the feeling of finally making it in there, and it does not disappoint on the creepy factor. Like, it's expertly creepy by the time we get in there, which makes me very happy as well. So I definitely wanted to try and do Charlotte's room justice. I had a lot of fun putting all of these clocks on the mantle because this is very similar to how it looks in the game, with this portrait, this very fancy portrait of a woman above the fireplace, and then all of the clocks. Fun fact, the woman above the fireplace is one of the Penvillins. So I thought that was kind of cool. It's kind of almost alluding to the fact that the Penvillins and the Thorntons might have some connection, like maybe there's some relationship there. So then I changed the wallpaper to try and more accurately reflect the wallpaper that actually was in Charlotte's room. And we just didn't have anything that was fancy enough and in the right color, so I just decided to go with this brown because I thought it got the notes enough. And I also really hated how the green wallpaper looked with the red curtains, but the curtains in the game were red. The Nancy Drew games have this really weird habit of putting red and green together within rooms as a design choice, and I don't know if that was like popular in the late 90s, early 2000s when these games were being made, but I can't do it. I can't bring myself to use red and green together as a design choice. It happened in Stay Tuned for Danger and Secrets Can Kill as well, in those living room spaces, and I just think it's kind of funny. It's not a choice I would make. If we're going to have bright red curtains, then you need to have a more neutral wall. Even if you're going to have bright green curtains or dark green curtains, then you have to have a more neutral wall. It just has to happen. But this was a big build, it was a fun build, and I really hope that you guys like it. We are coming up on the screenshots here very shortly after I put this little art nook in Charlotte's room, which it almost seems like an art nook, and it almost just might be a storage area for extra paintings, but either way, I make it an art nook. You guys should let me know down in the comments what you think. Do you think this looks like Thornton Hall? Can you imagine Thornton Hall looking or feeling this way? Which of the rooms would you stay in if you were to stay at Thornton Hall? If you could brave the ghosties, which room would you stay in? And just let me know how your 2021 is going so far. This is our first video of 2021, hopefully starting things off on a fun, positive note with this video and whatever is going on in your life. But anyway, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Sims 4 content. Thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.